Okay, the first thing we're going to look at is LBJ's domestic policies. For the most part, all of his domestic programs are characterized as the Great Society programs. You might remember going all the way back to Teddy Roosevelt. He had his Square Deal. Then Franklin Delano Roosevelt had the New Deal. Harry Truman had the Fair Deal. Lyndon Johnson's program is known as the Great Society. And as you can see from the name, he was trying to create a society that lived up to the greatness of its ideals. The first area where he spent a lot of his time and energy, as you know, was in the enactment of civil rights legislation. He built on the legacy of John F. Kennedy and the memory of John F. Kennedy to really push some of these things to get passed. Oftentimes John F. Kennedy is associated with civil rights legislation, but it's probably more accurate to say LBJ got all of this passed using the memory of John F. Kennedy. The first and probably the most important is the Civil Rights Act of 1964. We talked about that quickly. The Civil Rights Act was the first act that specifically outlawed discrimination based on race and gender, national origin, or ethnicity. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 was passed specifically to outlaw old practices going back to Reconstruction, such as poll taxes, literacy tests, and grandfather clauses, which were not so subtle ways to stop African Americans from registering to vote and voting in the South. In slightly after 1965, in 66 or 67, he issued Executive Order 11246, which said that all federal employers should use affirmative action to make sure they are not discriminating in any of their employment. It's one of the first times that the term affirmative action, which would become a controversial topic, would pop up. And finally, in 1968, he passed the Civil Rights Act of 1968, which specifically outlawed housing discrimination. This is, of course, an important year in the civil rights movement because things have become more violent. It's also the year that Martin Luther King was assassinated. Okay, his Great Society programs also extended beyond civil rights to include issues such as education and healthcare and the environment. So in terms of education, there were three significant programs that were started or legislation that was passed. The first is called the ESEA, right? Elementary and Secondary Education Act. And this is the act that says all students in the United States should receive a quality education. It allows for funding to be channeled towards low-income schools and low-income students. The current reauthorization of the ESEA is known as the No Child Left Behind, which I'm sure you're familiar with. Also, he started the Head Start program, which allowed for funding for preschool, particularly in areas of low socioeconomic status. So kids with low funding available could still attend preschool to give them a quote-unquote head start. And then finally he signed the Higher Education Act, which allowed for the creation of grants and subsidies and subsidized loans to make sure that people of low income could attend college. We still have some of these programs today, though the funding is not always what it has been. In terms of the environment, there are two important acts that were passed. This has been a constant struggle in the 20th century between environmentalists and industrialists. Some of the attention to the environment arose in the 1960s because of Rachel Carson's book called Silent Spring. So two acts that were important that were passed were the Clean Water Act, which was passed in 1965, I believe, and the Clean Air Act, which was passed in 67. Both established federal guidelines for regulating clean air and clean water, and basically put the responsibility on the states, but did establish a policy of clean water and clean air. And we're going to wrap up with just connecting a few other programs that are part of the Great Society. There was the establishment of public broadcasting. You are familiar with PBS. This is where for Sesame Street has been on for the last 35 years. NPR still exists. I listen to it every day. I recommend you do as well. It is National Public Radio. So this is PBS is television, NPR is radio, but it allows for a publicly funded mechanism to get the news out to the public. There's also support federally for arts programs. You might remember that this is similar to, it goes back to some of the WPA programs under the New Deal of Franklin Roosevelt that would fund literacy, the humanities, theater, etc. In terms of health, you already know, again, that the New Deal created the Social Security Administration, but two programs that extended benefits to the poor and the elderly are Medicare and Medicaid, allowing people to get medicine through the Social Security Administration if they can't already afford it. And that pretty much wraps up his domestic programs, at least from a high level. You got some of the key ideas, so this would be a good time to go review your notes, and then we'll continue with foreign policy in a moment.